Hello, I'm Barry Daniel, and this is the podcast of the Middle Way Society. Our aim is to encourage a universal approach to living a more integrated, ethical life, avoiding dogma or any appeal to authority. Our guest today is Molly Conisbee. Molly is a social historian and visiting research fellow at the Centre for Death and Society at the University of Bath. She has a PhD from the University of Bristol and has spent the last 10 years researching the social history of death and mourning. She's also a bereavement counsellor and has recently had published the book No Ordinary Deaths, A People's History of Mortality, and this will be the topic of discussion today. Hello, Molly, welcome to the Middle Way Society podcast.
Hi, Barry. Hi, thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome. Okay, could you perhaps begin then, Molly, by telling us a bit about your background and why you chose to write this book?
So my background, I did my PhD as a mature student. I'm a big fan and a big advocate of lifelong education, and I was very fortunate to get funding from the University of Bristol to pursue a PhD as a mature student. So I started my career in policy and public affairs and communications roles, eventually moving into various environmental organisations, Soil Association, which campaigns for organic food and farming, and then think tanks. So I came back to history and studied my PhD as a mature student. And I was really, up to that point, I had been leading guided walks on social history. And one of the things that kind of recurred in my interest in doing these guided history walks was burial sites, graveyards. I just found them such fascinating repositories of social history. As much as anything else, just looking at the names on headstones, thinking about what lives, had happened before those people became represented by a headstone. And it just was the seed, really, of a kind of interest in pursuing this and exploring how our forebears handled, well, what would have in the past been very high mortality rates compared to what we cope with these days, for example. And this kind of married with interests I'd had at school. I remembered a school project that we'd been given when I was about 10 or 11, and the teacher had asked us to speak to older people we knew, grandparents or older people we knew, and ask them what the biggest social change in their lifetimes had been. So I asked two of my grandparents, and they both, literally without hesitation and without consulting each other, they both said child mortality. And I remember at the time thinking, what a strange answer. My grandfather was a refugee. They'd both lived through wars. My grandmother had migrated from Ireland. They'd lived lives of, big, epic, tectonic change. Why would that be the thing that they would mention? And then reflecting on it, I thought, well, my granddad was one of four kids, two of whom died before the age of 3. My grandmother was one of 2 children, and her older sister died of diphtheria, before she was a teenager. And so grief had shaped their lives enormously, and their parents' lives, their whole family life. And I thought, my family's not unusual in that. Actually, most families, you go back a couple of generations in most family trees, and you will find levels of mortality, not just child mortality, but, by the time you're a teenager, it wouldn't necessarily be that uncommon to have lost a parent or several other relatives. So lots of people in the past spent an awful lot of their lives in a state of grief, loss, bereavement. And I was just very interested in how this shaped their experience and their relationship to the world. And I wanted to sort of explore that further from I call it No Ordinary Deaths, but the point of the title of the book in a way is to interrogate what we mean by ordinary experience, because of course all of our experiences are extraordinary because we are us. So it's that's what really kind of was the inspiration behind the book.
Yeah, well, one of the things I really liked about in the book was your focus on the experience of death of particularly ordinary individuals, and you've basically one for each chapter. So what was your rationale behind that?
I wanted to take a single story. I'm not trying to make any universal claims through the story of an individual, but what I wanted to do was to sort of try and humanise the experience of the everyday. So when I was at school, when we did history lessons, when we talked about death, if we talked about it at all, it was, dynastic deaths, if you will, kings, queens, politicians, things that felt like they shifted, the political and social landscape. We never really talked about the experience of ordinary death, unless it was a statistic, deaths in wars, for example, deaths in the First World War, that's a statistic. But actually that statistic is hundreds of thousands of devastated families, people who experience that loss and that grief. So what I was trying to do by taking an everyday story, taking a story from the archives, someone who didn't leave their mark on the history books, was to try and humanise what we're sometimes taught of as statistics.
Sure. Well, you were saying earlier that when you used to do those walks and you look on the gravestones and you wonder about those lives. For me, you really brought those people to life, which just gave a really good context for the book, which I thought was great. How did you actually organise the book, and how did you choose to organise it in such a way?
It was, had lots of thoughts about this, because I didn't necessarily want to do a sort of a chronological history, because I felt that was a bit confining. So the book is organised thematically, and it sort of takes the cycle of end of life to disposal to belief in the afterlife, if that makes sense. So it's organised across 11 chapters, and then the first chapter is looking at how people prepared for death. So how they were watched at the end of their life, perhaps by a neighbour or a kind of paid companion. And then I wanted to look at how the body was prepared. Wakes, which traditionally were before burial. We might now think about wakes as something that happens after a funeral, when you go to the sort of church hall or the pub or something, and you stand around and remember the person who's just been buried. But in the past, wakes happened before a funeral. Then I look at funerals, and then I look at the idea of memorial and how that's changed over time, and then mourning and the formalities of mourning, and grief and afterlife. So it's meant to look at a sort of cycle of preparing for death to kind of concepts of the afterlife. But as I said, it jumps around historically. Yeah. So the first story is a woman who was born in the late 18th century. The next chapter goes to the kind of late medieval period. And I jump around because I wanted the themes tie to particularly significant historical moments. So chapter 2, for example, which is it really is about the Reformation in the 1530s, the change from Catholicism to Protestantism, because that had profound implications for how people looked after the dead. So that was a real sort of signal moment when our relationship to dying and death changed culturally, at least in the United Kingdom. So I tried to choose stories that resonate with a kind of historical period, but kind of changed in some way our relationship to dying and death. So there's also a chapter about criminals, for example, that focuses around the mid-18th century when the Murder Act was passed, and so it kind of tries to fix on a kind of particular historical period that changed our relationship to dying and death.
Sure. Oh, well, let's dig a little bit deeper then, and so that. Well, the first one was watch. So could you just expand on that chapter a little bit then?
Yeah, so watching was almost really a profession in the past. So if it was felt that someone was coming towards the end of their life, it was felt important by a lot of cultures to kind of keep an eye on that person, not just to make sure if they needed a drink or their brow mopping, but also to watch very closely for the signs of death, because of course before most of us die in institutions these days, hospitals, care homes, hospices and so on. So we're kind of surrounded by medical expertise, but of course, well into the 20th century, most people died at home. So if you died at home, it was felt often important not to leave the dying person on their own, and also to very carefully watch for the signs of the end of life. And sometimes this had to be done just by sight or by knowledge, of understanding how the breathing changes and how the body's responses change towards the end of life, because stethoscopes weren't invented until 1816, and even after that they weren't in wide use. So often watchers would be employed to sit with the dying person, maybe read to them, sing with them, comfort them, mop their brow, offer them whatever pain relief there might be available. And then if it was felt that end of life was imminent, to gather family and friends to come and say their last farewells. So chapter 1 looks at the story of a woman called Mary Yen, who was born in late 18th century Southwark, which was then Surrey, is now part of London. And it traces her story as a nurse and as a watcher, and how she might have worked, the sort of tools that she would have had at her disposal to comfort the dying. I see watchers as sort of, I don't know, your listeners might have heard of doulas, death doulas, which is a sort of modern iteration, really. I think the watcher is the sort of great-great-great-grandmother of the doula, kind of fulfilled some of the same functions, a kind of semi-spiritual in some instances, but sometimes just a sort of physical comforting presence while someone was facing the end of life.
And why did they sort of start to, disappear? Was it partly the advent of medicine and moving towards the idea of diagnosis, etc.?
Yes, it was more or less perhaps a more medicalised approach. By the mid-19th century, late 19th century, the medical profession was becoming much more professionalised, and therefore intervening much more, including towards the end of life. So nurses and Florence Nightingale reformed nurses were sort of often just wise older women in the community. Florence Nightingale brought in all kinds of reforms to make nursing a much more respectable middle-class profession. So that tended to move watchers, and these things were seen as sort of slightly folklore-y, kind of old-fashioned approaches to managing death. And of course, into the 20th century, as I say, with the kind of rise of the welfare state and so on, we're much more likely now to sort of die in an institutional setting, surrounded by medical support, which is, of course, a great comfort to people in a different way. I'm not sort of creating some big divide between old and new.
No. But you do get the sense that, the 30 or 40 years that Mary Yen was active, in her role, that some real practical wisdom was lost there in a sense.
Absolutely. Well, I think I think it domesticated death very much, and that's a sort of theme that runs through the book in some ways. Maybe we'll talk about it more when we think about wakes and things. So death happened in the home. It was sort of normalised in that sense. And of course, there was wisdom and care. I'm sure there were some terrible nurses and watchers, but actually, I think it sort of brought it really into the kind of the family and the community realm. Again, when we look at waking, how the community came in to pay last respects, it sort of, perhaps medicalisation has, unless you work in palliative care or some aspect of healthcare, a lot of us won't see a body now for most of our lives. Whereas, so that kind of adds a sort of mystery to death, when in fact death is as natural as being born.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Then the next chapter was entitled Body and Soul.
That's a sort of intense chapter that deals with the English Reformation in the 1530s. It's very heavily draws for the primary research on a wonderful history called The Voices of Morbarth by a historian called Eamon Duffy. And Morbarth is a village in Devon, and we have a really fine record of the doings of Morbarth from the kind of 16th century, because their vicar, Christopher Trickey, kept these very detailed accounts of the community, and they weren't just ledgers of pounds and pence. He also wrote accounts of what the villagers were up to. So it's a really kind of rich portrait of kind of late medieval, early modern rural life in England or southwest England. And of course, so the main protagonist in that chapter is a woman called Lucy Scaly. She was a mill owner's wife. And it follows her journey. She sort of lived most of her life in great poverty. I mean, of course, we have very, very fragmentary records of people like Lucy, a peasant woman, really, a rural peasant woman of that period. There are no first-hand accounts because she was probably illiterate. We have no idea what she looked like. We can surmise what she wore and what she ate and so on from our general knowledge of the period. But what I was really interested in was that for Christopher, the vicar, and his flock, they lived through this transition of Henry VIII's initial schism with the Church of Rome, And then his son Edward, who inherits the throne eventually and is even more ultra Protestant. So Catholic tradition, which was very much based on a contract between the living and the dead. So if you died under Catholicism, whether you were rich or poor, you needed your community to pray for you. So Catholicism believed in purgatory, which was a kind of interim space, I suppose, between the living and the dead. And so obviously you hoped to go to heaven, but you had to spend a bit of time hanging around in purgatory and wait for your soul to be weighed so you could be assessed as to whether you got to go to the good place or the less good place. And part of the thing that expedited your journey to heaven was the prayers and the masses that would be sung by your community. So you were very reliant after death on the community holding your memory. Protestantism completely gets rid of this concept, completely gets rid of the concept of purgatory. Protestants believed in predestination. So they believed they were going to heaven. I assume most of them must have believed they were going there rather than the other place. So it took away that community role. Basically, you lived your life, you died, off you went to heaven. So it sort of completely stripped that kind of community element away around death, if that makes sense. What it also did was put much more emphasis on the funeral as a kind of social event. So a funeral was to sort of perhaps more what we're used to these days, was to sort of celebrate the individual and say, oh, John was a wonderful individual and he was a great dad and a fantastic teacher. It made that the norm rather than the community coming together and thinking, goodness me, we better get praying for John so he doesn't have to sort of stick around in purgatory for too long. So it kind of completely shifted the relationship between the living and the dead. What's interesting about Lucy's story is, again, because our records are sketchy for this period, we don't know exactly when she died. I'm surmising from Sir Christopher's notes that she died, round about the time that Mary inherited the throne from Edward. So she was a Catholic. So you've got to think a small community life swings from Catholic to Protestant to back to Catholic to when Elizabeth I takes over the throne in 1558, back to Protestant again. So you've got these communities thinking, what are we meant to do? Because the consequences of, being caught, and in the Protestant period, the consequences of doing Catholic things could result in, the death penalty, and vice versa, when the Catholics got back into power. So this was existential politically for people, but also spiritually and emotionally. So Lucy dies, just the same year as Queen Mary. We don't know whether she died a Catholic or a Protestant. We don't know what Christopher did. Did he give her Catholic rites? Did the community give her masses? Or did she die as a Protestant? And it's just a very interesting period because, again, this country is obsessed with the Tudors, wall-to-wall documentaries, but we rarely tend to reflect on what their behaviour did to ordinary people, and how that impacted on someone who was just thinking, what am I now? Because the church held people's identity. I mean, the church determined the year. In a small rural community like Morbath, the church told you when you planted your crops, when the land was blessed, when you harvested your crops, when you could get married, what you could eat on any day of the week. I mean, it absolutely sort of constructed life, So it's hard for us, perhaps in our more secular, individualistic age, to imagine how bound that community was and how traumatic it must have been. Whether you agree, I mean, I'm not coming at this from any ideological perspective, but whether you agree with either side, it still had an enormous and I think probably deeply traumatic impact on an awful lot of people, ordinary people,
Yeah, and also in modernity, we just take for granted that we have freedom of speech pretty much, and that but at that time, if you said something about your belief, it could potentially lead to your death.
Absolutely.
That must have been very difficult too. You touched on heaven and hell. what over them, and you go into this more in the chapter on the afterlife, but what happened to hell? Because even Protestants, for a period of time, when you associate hell and brimstone, it's with Protestantism, but the concept of hell, it's still, I'm sure some people still believe in it, but it dissipated to a large extent certainly in the 20th century. So what happened there, do you think?
I think probably the Enlightenment, the 18th century, killed hell. I think it was hard to reconcile the idea of a caring God, I suppose, with the idea that anybody would be sort of sent into the kind of open jaws of, if you look at sort of medieval visions of hell, often portrayed as, a huge beast with an open mouth and people being sort of dropped into the mouth or dropped into sort of boiling pots, or, pretty horrific images. I have to say, one of the challenges in writing the book is it's very hard to project belief onto people in the past. What do we mean by belief? If I say to you, I believe in such, how do you then interpret that? Through what I say. So, for example, there are lots of examples in the medieval church of vicars and bishops kind of complaining about the behaviour of their flocks in church, trying to ban them from bringing dogs and hawks into church, or playing dice, or, sort of flirting or playing around. So I think we can safely say that not every single medieval person was sort of quaking in terror at the prospect of being burned in hell.
But I think very encouraging, actually.
My goodness. I think, but probably what sort of killed it was sort of the kind of rational scientific movements of I'm using the word rational, again, that's something that we could probably unpack, but I think the kind of power of the dread of hell diminished somewhat in the kind of 18th century. Not to say it hasn't reared its head periodically. There was a great evangelical religious revival during the later 18th and 19th centuries. Didn't so much focus on hellfire and brimstone, although that was evoked by some of the kind of more passionate revivalists. But I think it's sort of unlikely that people believe that you could have, on the one hand, as I say, this loving, forgiving, cherishing, father-like God, and and hell. So I think it sort of diminished its hold over time. There are several accounts from sort of Enlightenment thinkers sort of more or less saying, well, hell doesn't really hold hold terror for the people anymore.
No, but just going back to terror, your next two chapters, disembodied and criminal, they're sort of connected in a sense, especially with the idea of dissection and anatomy, because this whole idea of dissection was people wanted to, when they got buried, they wanted to be buried whole, but so there was a lot of resistance towards dissecting human bodies. But then as time passed, the criminals were allowed to be dissected, and but anyway, could you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely, yes. Dissection has been a really controversial issue, still is for some communities, some religious communities particularly. So historically it was quite important for a lot of people to be buried whole, as you've said. That was because on the day of resurrection, you wanted to sort of emerge complete. So it had great religious and emotional significance for a lot of people to be sort of buried intact. The problem was, certainly from the sort of later medieval period onwards, human curiosity about the body, about medicine, and about sort of scientific advances meant that anatomists and scientists wanted bodies to experiment on. They wanted to be able to open them up and see how everything worked. So the difficulty was finding a steady enough supply of bodies to kind of supply this trade. This had reached sort of crisis point by the 18th century, by which point you're getting a real explosion of people wanting to study medicine in particular and anatomy. So in 1752, the government passed the Murder Act, And the Murder Act not only, it allowed anatomists to have the bodies of anybody who was executed for murder. In fact, it was wider than that, and they were often given bodies of people executed generally. And executions happened for what we would nowadays consider relatively sort of trivial offences, sort of thieving cloth or silver or what have you, or poaching. So things we would think of, today as relatively trivial offences often ended up in execution. So often the bodies were then given to anatomists. So murderers particularly would be anatomized in public. These would be public spectacles, and people would be sort of chopped down from the gallows and then whisked off to the surgeon's hall. They'd be shaved, the body would be shaved. Partly that's dehumanizing, also partly because people often left prison in a filthy state, and then they would be dissected publicly. Now, I think the unintentional consequence of the Murder Act, of course, was that it conflated dissection even more with punishment in people's minds. Yeah. So it was not only were you going to be hanged, but you were also going to be dissected afterwards, and that was almost a fate worse than death. So often families would be, you get these unseemly scenes at executions where families would be trying to fight the anatomists off from taking the body. It was considered an incredible shame, social shame, for this to happen to somebody.
It must have added an additional sense of terror for the people who are going to be executed as well, because they...
Absolutely, yes. I mean, kind of considered a really sort of horrific, really kind of horrific punishment. There's a famous sequence of etchings by William Hogarth, the 18th century artist, called The Four Stages of Cruelty, and they follow the journey of this horrible person called Tom Nero, who he starts off, stealing things and torturing a dog and so on, and he has this sort of life of misdeeds. And the very last plate, which is reproduced in the book, is Tom being anatomized publicly. So there's a sort of gallery of men in long 18th century wigs watching him as he's sort of sliced open. Hogarth is sort of saying, well, yes, Tom was cruel, but this is also a stage of cruelty. So there was a kind of ambivalence, I think, among some Enlightenment thinkers around dissection. Yeah. In the 19th century, so the problem was there's still, even with anatomists being allowed to use the bodies of criminals, there still weren't enough bodies. For the great expansion of medical schools and anatomy schools in the later 18th and 19th century, they still needed more bodies. The lack of bodies led to grave robbing in some instances, which became very notorious. People became very frightened that after their death, their body might be taken from their grave. So some people went to enormous lengths, putting sort of great slabs over their graves, or you can get these things called mort safes, which look like sort of metal cages fitted over the grave. And some graveyards employed security guards to ensure the bodies wouldn't be stolen. But the anatomists and the anatomists, I have to say, were perfectly complicit in this supply of bodies. It wasn't just the kind of no anatomist, as far as I'm aware, ever got arrested, of course, for receiving these stolen goods. But there were plenty of gangs in operation, perhaps most notoriously Burke and Hare in Edinburgh. Anatomists continued to lobby the government to be allowed more access to bodies, and they, in the end, passed the Anatomy Act of 1832, which was an incredibly controversial piece of legislation, because the Anatomy Act allowed anatomists to take bodies from workhouses. So if somebody died in the workhouse and their body wasn't claimed quickly by family or friends, the workhouse could then send it to local hospital or the local anatomy school to be dissected. And so you can imagine, this absolutely fixated certain communities on the fact that poverty, not only criminality but poverty, was also to be punished further after death by a potential anatomization. So, and there were big protests about the Anatomy Act, particularly Liverpool and Exeter had quite big riots because of the Anatomy Act, and it became a bit of a conspiracy theory as well. So people in workhouses got into these conspiracy theories about, that Anatomy Act was there to sort of kill off the poor, to cull the poor, and that they might be fed the bodies of other paupers. Anatomy soup was one of the conspiracy theories. So immensely controversial piece of legislation.
We'll move on to the next theme, which is wakes. Now, like in modernity, we certainly in Europe we associate wakes with the Irish, but obviously wakes were very much a common thing. You talk a lot about the history of wakes in Wales, don't you, in the book?
Yeah, the Irish are famous for their wakes. There's some wonderful histories about Irish wakes. So I thought, well, I won't add much by writing more about Irish wakes because there's such a lot of rich writing on that theme. So I wanted to look at Wales, and the Welsh traditions were very interesting as well. I mean, the thing to say about wakes is that, and a lot of death practice is, it's very, very localized. So you literally to the point where what you do in one village might be quite different from what people did in the next village. There's often very, very localized folklore around what's right and fitting to do for the dead. But certainly, probably sort of 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, wakes could be, quite wild affairs. They certainly would involve alcohol and smoking. It was considered traditional to offer people visiting the body. So as I said earlier, the wake would happen before burial. So you might display the body in the parlour in an open casket. The community would come round and pay respects. Some wakes were quite sober affairs. They might be quite religious. You might have some Bible readings, perhaps a drink and a piece of cake, and off you'd go. But there are accounts of other wakes that were kind of quite wild affairs, involving lots of drinking, card playing, some quite eye-opening horseplay, I suppose we'd call it, removing the body from the coffin and, hiding someone living in there so they would pop out and make visitors jump. Or there was one account in Wales of bodies being winched up through the chimney. And, again, these probably deeply pre-Christian in practice. It was considered very important not to leave the body alone after death. So there had to be people around the body between death and burial, because that's considered quite a dangerous time, where the soul might be tempted to wander or to go off with devils. So it was important to keep lights, candles around the body, but also keep company with it. So, of course, I suspect a lot of these wake rituals just evolved to kind of pass the time as much as anything else before burial.
Right. So the horseplay was perhaps more to do with passing the time rather than helping the journey of the deceased person. Then, do you think?
I think it might have been that. It might also have been it might have been to tease the devils. It might have been to distract evil spirits. I mean, really, the absolute meaning of a lot of this behaviour is probably lost in the mists of time. And as I say, I mean, sometimes people would do play acting, dress up as priests. A lot of it was quite subversive, I think. Or kind of an inversion of, the funeral, the formalities of the funeral to come, a bit like carnivals, where you get the Lord of Misrule. So I think the practices are fascinating, but very diverse. As I say, it's hard to be really general about them. Wakes certainly became more sober affairs. I talked earlier about the evangelical revival of the late 18th and 19th centuries. And from then on, wakes became much more formal occasions and would usually centre around maybe some readings from the Bible and a very sort of respectful, sober affair. a cup of tea rather than a a glass of whiskey or whatever. But the kind of earlier iterations could be quite wild. Evidently, I think they sound quite fabulous. Anyone is welcome to drink gin over me when I'm gone.
There's something also just feels really healthy about the fact that you're with the body, and I think that's something that really very rarely happens in modernity. We tend to euphemize death, and also we very rarely see a dead body. It's again something about the wake that gives this impression that that death was a very collective thing, a community thing.
Absolutely. I think you make a really good point there. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it was very much the community coming together, and I think there's evidence, especially the death positive movement, which is a kind of contemporary movement, which is trying to perhaps reintroduce some of these older practices. It's very oriented around people helping to care for the body, perhaps sitting with the body for a while, because it helps us to start processing grief, rather than just have an undertaker come and sort of whisk the person away, which can be quite destabilizing, I think, in terms of beginning to process one's grief.
Yeah, there was a beautiful little thing in the book where there was a gentleman called was it Russell Davidson, and in 2017 he kept the body of his 55-year-old wife. Do you mind if I just read the little passage from? So it was an interview he gave, and he said, "There was nothing that upset me about being in a room with her." This is his wife, Wendy. "She looked absolutely beautiful, just as she always did in life, radiant. It was a comfort to have her there. It gave my mind time to realise that yes, she was dead, and yes, I did miss her, but it also showed me life had to go on and helped me understand she wasn't coming back, so I could start grieving." I just found that really moving.
It's gorgeous, isn't it? And I believe from memory, he had 2 sons as well, teenage sons, and together, they prepared her and they put flowers around, and he said, as you've read, that it really helped them, to kind of come together and start the healing process.
Yeah, okay, and that was lovely. Okay, and then moving on, the next chapter was you talk about funerals. So, how old a concept is the idea of a funeral and the idea of burial as well? How old are these practices?
Well, I think burial of some kind, goes back. Obviously, communities since the dawn of time have had to find ways to dispose of their dead, and lots of those practices have evolved because of things like geography. Depends whether communities are nomadic or subsistence or more settled. We tended to get burial practices as communities became more settled, and certainly marking burials as communities became more settled with agriculture and so on. So, we're talking sort of 10,000 years ago. So, but funerals have sort of changed their meaning over time. I mean, we obviously don't really know what people did way back in the past and what significance end of life rituals had. We can look at grave goods and things that we've found in Neolithic burials, but that doesn't necessarily tell us what their relationship to the ritual was. We talked earlier about the sort of medieval period. Those sorts of burials tended to be incredibly simple, actually, even for unless you were very wealthy kings and queens and things. But so most people's kind of medieval burials were incredibly, buried in a shroud, masses. As I said, the funeral itself wasn't so significant. The important thing were the masses and the obits and the prayers that came afterwards. Funerals began to become somewhat more elaborate from the 17th century onwards with the kind of Protestant Revolution, because funerals became much more of a social event, because you weren't worrying about the destiny of the soul. You wanted to have a kind of a social event to kind of mark the end of life. So from that period onwards, funerals, for those that could afford it, funerals tended to become much more important social events.
When did coffins first come along?
Well, coffins were used in the medieval period, but often they were used just to transport the body, and then the body would be buried in a shroud, and then the coffin. So recycled, it's kind of like an early form of green burial. The coffin would simply be used because wood was hugely expensive and a valued resource. You didn't just bung it in the ground.
Yeah.
But I guess that the kind of as the economy evolved, as our consumer culture evolved over the 18th and 19th centuries, funerals became more affordable to a much kind of wider demographic. So they became more elaborate as a result. Things like coffins became much more common because suddenly they could be mass made, and more people could afford them. Carriages, probably reaching the high point. Your listeners, might think of a 19th century funeral, a high Victorian funeral with a carriage and horses with plumes and lots of mourners and men, with top hats and swathed in crepe and so on. That was really a reflection of the sort of high point of 19th century capitalism, which meant that these products could be made cheaply and more accessibly. So along with that, funerals became more and more elaborate.
What about the idea? And now you find quite often when people have a funeral that it's often a celebration of people's lives, a bit like perhaps the wake is, but you find that in the funeral now. I'm just thinking of the film Four Weddings and a Funeral, and they play Bye Bye. Bye Bye Baby by Bay City Rollers, and that kind of feeling at a funeral. Is that just a modern thing, or this idea of as a funeral as a celebration of someone's life?
I think nowadays funerals reflect a much more individualistic society. I mean, in the past, most would have followed, the kind of the prayer book, the Book of Common Prayer, and so on, and followed a kind of Church of England ritual. Into the 20th century, of course, we've become we're consumers in different ways. We expect to express a kind of different sort of individualism. So these days you can sort of do more or less anything. Some people even have living funerals, so if they know they're nearing the end of life, they're like, well, I want to hear all the good things people are going to hopefully say about me, so I will be present. Or there's a new fashion now for unaccompanied cremation, for example. That's actually one of the fastest growing areas of disposal, which is also quite an interesting theme. But as you say, they're now much more celebratory, they're more individualistic, they focus perhaps much more on what the person was, what they meant, professionally, personally, and you might get all kinds of, instruction, I don't know, not to wear black rather than to wear black, or, there are green funerals where people, green funerals today where you might be buried in an organic shroud in a meadow or something. I mean, that would have been considered a pauper burial in the 19th century. So our fashions change, I think, according to the kind of social and economic and cultural changes of society.
Yeah, okay. And then there was the next chapter entitled Queerly Beloved, which I found was a really important chapter about how difficult this whole process of death with people who were, from the gay community, or people, from marginalised communities. You talk about, for example, the idea of disenfranchised grief. Could you just expand on that theme a little bit?
Absolutely. Well, not all funerals are celebratory, and not all people get to acknowledge their relationship to the deceased. So, for example, historically, homosexuality, for example, was illegal. So if you were in a gay relationship and your partner died, you weren't necessarily publicly allowed to acknowledge that and grieve, which kind of feels horrific to us today. But that was the reality that lots of people had to live with, or, as you say, otherwise marginalised. So it's kind of adds another kind of complexity to so-called ordinary experience, those sorts of relationships that had to be kind of lived under the radar. And disenfranchised grief is something we talk about in counselling, for example, in bereavement counselling, because sometimes people are not allowed to, as I say, publicly express their feelings about the loss of a loved one, and therefore they're sort of sitting there holding this grief, and it has nowhere to go, because actually part of grieving is a kind of communal acknowledgement of our loss. That can be very important for people to process. So I really wanted to reflect the fact that there were all kinds of communities for different reasons that didn't fit the sort of dominant norms and mores of their time, and how complex that could be for the people that were left behind.
Yeah, sure. Okay, moving on to the next chapter, memorial. Now, your dog walk is a great example of how we honour the dead everywhere.
Absolutely. I wanted to reflect the fact that you may not realise it when you're out on a walk, but actually memorial is more or less everywhere. So there's this sort of death hangs in the landscape in quite interesting ways. So you might not think about it, but you might walk past, graveyards or cemeteries or memorial benches or parks named in memory of somebody or trees planted in memory of somebody. It's sort of there marking the landscape. And I really wanted to sort of try and tease out the fact that it sort of sits with us wherever we go, and not in a morbid way. I think that's rather lovely. I think planting trees or a bench for the weary is a lovely way to remember somebody.
Yeah. And there's something often very poetic about epitaph, isn't there? There's a great epitaph in the book that really speaks from the grave about the brevity of life. If you don't mind, it's all you that come my grave to see, as you read this pray, think on me. Repent in time, do not delay. I in my prime was called away. I thought that was lovely. It reminded me, actually, as I spoke to you, I used to live in Spain, and I came across this graveyard once, and outside the grave it said, there was a little sign with a skull and crossbone, and it says, "Lo que tú eres, yo fui, lo que yo soy, tú serás." And that basically means, what you are, I was, what I am, you will be.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. It sort of encapsulates it, doesn't it? There's, I think, the Epicurean epitaph is, I was, I am not, I do not care. So it's that sense of, I quite like it, that erasure of self, but not in a bad way. It's sort of, it's like, I think the Mark Twain quote about he wasn't worried about death because he didn't remember what life was like before he was born. So it was the same
thing. Yes.
Same thing. It's sort of, yeah.
Okay. And then mourning. So how does mourning differ from grief? There's often a bit of a conflation there, isn't there?
There is, and I think so. There are two chapters. There's one on mourning and one on grief in the book, and they do sort of cross over somewhat. And it's not a sort of neat divide. I'll own. I tend to think, or the way I've approached it in the book, is mourning as the kind of external signs of loss and bereavement. So again, listeners might think about the 19th century, think about Queen Victoria in her widow's weeds and so on. So that kind of high mourning was a very external expression of her grief after the death of her husband, Prince Albert, in 1861. Whereas grief is perhaps our more internal processes as we start to kind of cope with the loss of people that we've cared about. So the mourning chapter, it looks at how that evolved over time. Again, it sort of evolves really with consumer cultures in terms of, for example, Queen Victoria's approach of wearing all black. Until before the 19th century, black is actually a very difficult colour to make. It's a very expensive colour to make. So most people would not have worn mourning dress. They might have had a little black ribbon or a shawl or an armband, but they wouldn't have dressed all in black because that was actually beyond the purse strings of most people who mourned in the past. Mourning dress became much more expected and much more affordable during the 19th century with mass production of textiles and the invention of synthetic dyes, which meant it was actually cheaper to kind of produce black material. But mourning was often kind of quite formally organised. You were expected to have, particularly women, I have to say, particularly middle-class women and upper-middle-class women were expected after the death of a husband, for example, to withdraw from public life for a period of time until it was sort of respectable to reintroduce themselves into society. So often the expectations around mourning were quite formally organised, and certainly again the high point of the 19th century, upper middle class women might be expected to spend upwards of 2 years in mourning dress and not contemplate doing anything like moving house or certainly not receiving gentlemen callers until a decent period of time had passed.
Yeah. Do you think there's some value in that though? I mean, I think in modernity, we often, in our individualistic way of thinking about things, we often encourage to, at some point, think, okay, let's move on now. Whereas there was, both with mourning and grief, there was far more, I think, an acceptance of, this was a very, very difficult period for you, and a lot of difficult emotions that you don't have much chance to rehearse with, but also that say again, an example with mourning and the clothing, it was a signal to people to perhaps be more compassionate to that person and the difficulties they're going through.
I agree. I think that's a really good point. I think it can look a little absurd and over the top to us these days. If you look at a picture of a photograph of a woman in, high mourning, and we think, oh gosh, that's a little bit absurd, swathed in crepe and so on. On the other hand, clothes were visual signifiers, and people would have known from the way that one was dressed at what stage of mourning one was at. I recount in the book a conversation with a colleague who unfortunately had a child that died, and she recounted to me that people would sort of cross the road to avoid speaking to her because I imagine they were just worried about saying the wrong thing. We can feel very awkward after somebody's had a bereavement. We don't really know what to say. And so what mourning did, and the formalities of mourning, it kind of created an etiquette around it, which, as I say, can be constricting, but could also, I think, deserves a sympathetic reassessment, because it could also be liberating, because so many people, just returning right back to the beginning of our conversation, because so many people experienced grief. I think there was perhaps more awareness of what to say or how to respond to it, and how to respond to it when one's contemporaries were also in mourning.
Yeah, but I think you also made a really interesting point that there's often an assumption that because people experienced a lot more death in the past, that somehow they would have grieved less. But there doesn't seem to be any evidence, even though you perhaps had more coping strategies in one sense, that and you had more support, but the actual pain of grief itself was, I imagine, was just as acute.
Absolutely. There have been some historians who have argued that because people assumed they would lose children and so on, that actually they didn't grieve as intensely as perhaps we might expect to today. But I can't find any evidence for that personally. I think perhaps people in the past expressed themselves differently. We can't impose our kind of modern form of expressing our kind of modern relationship to kind of discourses around mental health and emotional states. We can't impose that on the past. But I have not found any compelling evidence that people were any more any more relaxed about end of life or losing people that they loved than we might feel today.
Yeah, I think the other thing that springs to mind with that is that I think sometimes there's a bit of an obsession in modern day life about happiness, and if a loved one died, you wouldn't want not to suffer, would you? You wouldn't want not to feel that pain. It wouldn't feel right, would it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, perhaps it just sort of steps into grief, which is the next chapter in the book. Actually, learning to sit with grief is part of the process. There's a lovely phrase about, grief is love with nowhere to go. And it's for many of us, I think the most painful thing that we need to experience, and certainly in counselling spaces, grief is one of the most consistent reasons I think that people come to find a safe space to speak about how they feel. Absolutely, I think this is the price of caring for things, people, animals, the living beings that make up our life and our experience. So it's painful and very, very difficult, but it's also part of our experience of being alive, I think.
Yeah. When I'm a Samaritan, and many of the calls that you have, people are grieving in some form, and as you say, often it's animals, because often it's people who are on their own, and an animal is they're an embodied being that they have a real connection with.
Absolutely. There's lots of research now that suggests that our sense of loss when an animal, a companion animal, dies is just as intense as any other family member. And I think I'm very, very respectful of that. I've always had pet dogs, and I have always felt intensely bereaved. My life is organised around the needs of the dog to an extent, because, she needs to go for a walk, she needs to have food, So they're a huge part of, as they should be, as every living thing should be. And now, of course, we're starting to think about grief for the environment, for example. There is a strand of research around, environmental degradation and how that impacts on people emotionally. That's us being in tune, I think, with the space that we call home.
Yeah. Okay. And then the last chapter, just to introduce it, do you mind if I read out that poem on a tired housewife?
Not at all.
So it's an anonymous poem from 1905. You started the chapter with this. So, here lies a poor woman who was always tired. She lived in a house where help wasn't hired. Her last words on earth were, "Dear friends, I am going to where there's no cooking or washing or sewing. For everything there is, exactly to my wishes, from where they don't eat, there's no washing of dishes. I'll be where loud anthems will always be ringing, but having no voice, I'll be quit of the singing. Don't mourn for me now, don't mourn for me never. I'm going to do nothing forever and ever." So, just love that. Why did you introduce the chapter with that poem, Molly?
I wanted to introduce the chapter with that poem because I wanted us to reflect on our concept of heaven is actually related to our experience of life. So if I am constantly hungry, my idea of heaven is probably an endless feast. If I'm constantly tired, like this poor woman who's, washing and cooking and sewing and looking after children, my idea of heaven is doing nothing at all, is eternal rest. So our concept of heaven is located to an extent in what our personal experiences and our collective experiences. And so heaven changes, our idea of heaven changes. I think I also referenced the Big Rock Candy Mountain song, 1930s Depression era song. And of course, Depression era, people are hungry. They're having to move around from place to place in search of work, so the idea of heaven is, lakes of whiskey and wine and cigarette trees and rivers of stew and so on. Of course, because it's the land of plenty.
Okay. As a historian, it must be very difficult to access what people actually did think about the afterlife in many ways.
It's very hard, I think, because there are, different accounts, and of course different religious traditions have a very different concept of what happens after death. Some obviously have reincarnation at their heart, some have an idea of heaven, some cultures, eternal, a sort of spiritual realm. So it is hard, and I didn't want to give too academic an account of notions of heaven. You can dive into kind of all kinds of ecclesiastical definitions of what happened, and actually even artistically heaven is always portrayed, I think, in rather vague terms. If you think about sort of church paintings, and it's maybe Jesus with some saints sort of sitting around in a golden city, and you think, well, what do they do all day, and the idea of the afterlife did exercise our ancestors. I mean, there were lots of debates about what it was and what it meant and what people would get up to. Were you embodied? Were you disembodied? Were you sitting around on a cloud? Was it a beautiful garden? Was it a family reunion? Very sort of complicated, different ideas about what heaven actually was. For the book, I've focused on some of the non-conformist religions. End-of-life deathbeds were very important, and they recorded what happened on deathbeds as an insight into what might happen as part of the afterlife. So if you're familiar with John Bunyan's famous poem, The Pilgrim's Progress, he starts by having a dream. And so this kind of dreamlike state, or the end of life state, was meant to be quite a big insight into what might come as the afterlife. So Baptist magazine and Methodist magazine often recorded what people said as their last words. And so I give the account of a printer from Newcastle, Thomas Angus, and his deathbed, and him sort of calling out for Jesus, and the priest who's with him writing down his last words is sort of, oh, look, he's going to be crossing the river and over to the other side. Because John Bunyan, and this was very influential on the Baptists and the Methodists, imagined this crossing of the river and you would go to the Golden City on the other side. So that's one way we can get maybe a little bit of insight into sort of how working and artisan classes in the past kind of conceived of heaven. I also look at the case of a lady called Eliza Bodell, who was a spiritualist, and spiritualism was a huge movement, particularly in the later 19th century. Again, very popular sort of working class and artisan class communities. And they believed in a spiritual realm, so a kind of third space, as it were. There was that we progress into a kind of spiritual state, so not necessarily embodied state, but hard to put into words, actually, really. I suppose a kind of disembodied but presence. And she this lady sort of died at the end of the 19th century. She'd struggled quite a lot with ill health, evidently, but there was rather a nice obituary written in the Spiritualist magazine, which is called The Two Worlds, by, I suspect, her daughter. It might have been her son or daughter, because they have the same initial, but I think it was probably by her daughter. And it just more or less says, she's gone to prepare the way for the family to follow. So there was this sense of you would be this sort of spiritual presence, but you would somehow be reunited with the people that you'd loved in life, which again must have been very comforting, particularly comforting to people who had otherwise tough lives, very materially constrained lives compared to the ones that we experience now.
Yeah. Well, if you look back on all the study that you've done for the book, and if you could just think about what can we, in practical terms, with regard to how we deal with death, what could we bring into our modern lives? What have we perhaps lost, and and realistically, what could we do to because a lot of the practices were really helpful, I find it hard to imagine them as going around dressed in black again and like that. But I'm sure there's quite a few things we could apply. I presumably had some thoughts on that.
I think I'm not personally religious, but my feeling, having studied all of this and really thought about death and dying a lot, is really, if we can engage with it, it can be quite, if we can engage with the idea that we are going to die, whatever your belief is of what comes after, it can actually be quite liberating, because actually for me, I shouldn't speak for how this plays with others, but for me, it makes me less bothered by material things. Actually, it's much more about grounding myself in the here and now, trying to appreciate the moment and be present, but also to think about the environment, the things to tread lightly, the things I would like to leave for whoever comes after me generationally. And I think I think if you really engage with the fact that you can't take stuff with you, you've got this moment, you've got this miracle that's your existence. And it will be we may not choose the time of our end. We have no idea for any of us when the end comes. So to really sort of be present, enjoy the moment, but also to kind of tread lightly, I suppose, to think about those that come after, that we're just here borrowing. We're borrowing our little patch of space, and to sort of therefore tend it, look after it, care for one another. I know this is probably making me sound like a sort of wafty hippie, but actually it's important, I think, because I think it can help us reassess our relationship to the material, because you can't take it, to use your grand's old cliche, you can't take it with you. So you can spend a life, if you want, accumulating lots and lots of things and lots of money, but you can't take it with you. The important thing is the here and now. So that, to me, I think felt like the most, as it were, spiritual element of the book. It was a sort of, we have this brief time, use it well.
That came across really well in the book, Molly. What's that saying? Shrouds have no pockets. But I'm actually, me and my partner, we're actually we're in a death group, just to keep the name light. We meet up on Zoom once every couple of months. There's about 7 or 8 of us, and it's not that we want to be morbid about death, but neither do we want to be avoidant about it. I'm 66 now, and it's like, I just want to be able to face it head on, and also that it's, it's just part of life. You wouldn't have life without death anyway, would you?
Exactly. Well, there are lots of Greek myths about, people who wish to live forever, and it's always a disaster, because end of life gives your life context. If you went on and on, there would never be any impetus to do anything, really, in some ways. I think that's quite right. A lovely friend in her 80s now, and she calls it Sniper's Alley, being her age, constantly, which I think is brilliant. I said to her, I'm going to shamelessly steal that phrase off you.
Well, a couple of people in our group, they say they're there because they're in complete denial, but it's the act of actually coming along and talking about it. But I'm just curious also how all this study might have fed into your work as a bereavement counsellor.
I've always wanted my research to have a practical application. I've never been interested in a sort of academic career in that sense. I think what's really useful about history is when people say, what do you research? And you say, dying and death. And they go, ooh, that's a bit grim. And you say, well, yeah, but it's in the post, for you. I think what it helps do, if you can talk about the kind of long context, the reality, for all of us, that we are mortal, it gives people a kind of bit like your group sounds like, it gives people a permissive path to talk about their mortality. I think that can be quite helpful. If you have someone kind of coming into counselling because they're really scared of dying, if you can put it in historical context, that's a way for them to sort of start to unpack their feelings. So even in quite simple historical context, it might be that they've reached 62 and you talk to them a bit, and then you realise that both their parents died at the age of 62. So you're giving them a sense of family history and saying, well, of course you're feeling anxious about it because those were big losses for you, or you can. But I found that on the history walks as well, is you can describe things that happened in the past, and that opens people up to then sharing, oh yes, that reminds me of when my auntie, or this happened. So I think it gives us a trajectory, a sense that our struggles are not unique. They, our ancestors also had these fears and worries and had to work out ways to manage their anxieties about mortality, how to live well, how to die well. We're not special.
No, that really came across in the book. And again, with my death, and it's what you were saying about being more present. I find it by and large really life affirming. But anyway, my last question, Molly. it's one I always ask people on this podcast is, what's your understanding of the middle way, if any? It might not, and if so, how might it relate to what we've been talking about?
I think my understanding of the middle way is, obviously it's in a sort of Buddhist tradition about, in a sense, not adopting a kind of extreme position. It's about a kind of holistic approach of saying, I shall listen, I shall be present, I shall try and balance these views, but not taking a kind of extreme ideological. And this is one of the problems we face now. I mean, I really reflect on this a lot with politics, for example. It's almost like you have to pick a side and start shouting. Yeah. We've lost that kind of nuance around having a respectful discussion, a debate. We might disagree with each other, but we can do it nicely. We can really hear each other, take the time to hear each other. So that's kind of very loosely my interpretation of it being a kind of a broad acceptance, a path through the extremes. Okay, great. And if people wanted to find out more about your work, Wally, how would they go about it? Well, there's the book, obviously, and they're very welcome to contact me. I'm a member of the Centre for Death and Society, as you said, at the University of Bath. So my contact details are there. So we flag up the walks. I do quite a lot of walks. So if they happen to be in the Southwest and I happen to be doing one, they're very welcome to join me. I do dip a toe in social media. So I'm on Blue Sky and Twitter, to my shame. So often, update on research projects there as well. So, and hopefully we'll be writing more and speaking more on this subject. Great. Okay, well, it was an absolute pleasure talking to you today, Molly. And again, I really, really love the book, and I'd highly recommend it. So, good luck with that, and thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks. I really enjoyed that.
You can find out more about Middle Way philosophy at www.middlewaysociety.org.